I love shooting with really shallow depth of field. Shooting wide open helps create a sense of depth in your images by separating the subject out from their surroundings. There's some challenges though with this technique if you're lighting your subject using flash or studio strobe outdoors. For the most creative control when shooting outdoors, I typically do my primary lighting with strobe and use ambient light, which is the existing natural light, for just fill lighting. This means that the artificial strobe lighting has to overpower the natural light. To do that, you have to use a higher shutter speeds to knock down the ambient exposure. This is really effective since the very short duration strobe lighting is less dependent upon shutter speed than the constant natural light exposure. Typical exposure for ambient light originating from the overcast sky or open sky light source is f11 15th of a second, 100 ISO. I like to underexpose the ambient light 2 to 3 stops darker than the camera setting, thus creating a -2 or -3 fill light ratio. And then let my strobe lights create the main and accent lighting. To do this, you could set your camera to f11 at 100 ISO and then regulate the power on the strobe lights to work with this setting, and then dial the shutter speed to a faster speed like a 60th of a second for a 2-stop underexposed ambient fill, or 125th of a second for a 3-stop underfill. But what if you want to have some serious shallow depth of field like f2.8 to really boost the feeling of depth in your image? Doing this really starts to make things complicated because your camera's shutter most likely can't sync with the strobe exposure at anything over a 200th of a second. And shooting at f2.8 with the ambient light underexposed by 2 to 3 stops requires a shutter speed of 1,000th to a 2,000th of a second. That's way beyond your camera's shutter sync speed. Now you could use Highspeed Sync or Hypersync if your lighting equipment has the capability, but if not, then you're stuck using neutral density filters, which by the way are also called ND. These are placed over the camera lens to drop the ambient and flash strobe exposure so that you can work with slower shutter speeds that are within the camera's shutter sync speed range. Neutral density means light reducing density without a color shift, hence the word neutral. But in reality, it's not totally neutral. It does shift the color ever so slightly, but nothing a custom white balance can't handle. ND comes as a screw-on lens filter as well as an optically correct gel for use over your camera lens. Their purpose is to reduce exposure partially blocking light, and they are available in 1/3 up to 20 stops of light-sucking filtration. ND would be a great solution if it were not for the fact that your through-the-lens view of the image can and usually does get very dark with the application of ND. But if you're shooting with a good mirrorless camera rather than a digital SLR, the super high-resolution electronic viewfinder can be set to live view setting effect off. Live view setting effect is what this feature is called on my Sony. Other brands have the same ability, but the feature is named differently. When live setting effect is set to on, the live image that is displayed on the electronic viewfinder and on the rear display is affected by your exposure settings and ISO. When set to off, the image is set to what the camera thinks is a correct brightness level, no matter what the exposure settings are at. For instance, the image appears okay on the camera's electronic displays, even if the camera exposure settings are set to grossly over or underexpose the image. So you shouldn't judge exposures using the displays. Being the perfectionist freak that I am, I always use a handheld light meter anyway, so this isn't a problem. In this image, I worked with a -3 stop ND gel filter over the lens, and in the viewfinder, it is perfectly bright. So focusing, directing the model, etc., as though the -3 ND did not exist. With 3 stops of ND, now the shutter speed could be slowed down to a 250th of a second, and by changing my ISO from 100 to 50 allowed me to drop the shutter speed down another stop to 125th of a second. Perfect my exposure would be f2.8 at 125th of a second at 50 ISO, underexposing the ambient light by 3 stops, giving me a slow enough shutter that the camera would be able to record the burst of light from the strobe, and all this with a nice bright image in the viewfinder. To finish off this session, I have a couple of points to add. You can use more than one ND filter over the lens to build up enough density if you don't have the exact filter you need. But bear in mind that any filter you put over the lens, even if considered optically correct, as they should be, will slightly degrade the image. Generally, don't go over 3 filters deep. As for me, I'm a sharpness fiend. I rarely use more than 1. In this image, I needed 4 stops of ND to drop the exposure low enough to get a suitable shutter speed. But I only had a 3-stop ND, so I dropped the exposure down by additional stop using the camera's ISO. I switched from 100 to 50 ISO. The filter I used was an old 1980s Kodak Raton ND, which was placed over the lens. I used this rather than a screw-on filter for the simple reason I didn't have a screw-on available. The screw-on would be a better choice since it would be straight over the lens. I didn't have a filter holder for the 70-200mm lens, so my vintage ND filter was just jammed into the lens shade over the lens, which bent and bowed the gel, which is not the best scenario for optics and not the most secure. But it got the job done. Besides, it was almost free. I paid for it some 30 years ago.